Welcome to part two of the Populist Party. We're going to be looking at the rise and fall of the Populist Party some more, and particularly in this video, we're going to focus on how farmers tried to deal with those problems that we talked about last time. If you remember, we talked about drop in crop prices and their farms being foreclosed on and railroad rates being really high, so it was hard to ship goods. So farmers blamed really kind of two sides. They, of course, blame the railroads for the railroad rates, and by default, blame banks and industry in general. They felt like big business was too much a part of their problems. But they also blamed the government to a degree, both at the federal and the state level, and felt that those were areas that had to change. And I think many of you probably guessed at least the railroads, maybe the government. And so farmers started to demand several things. The first was that the government needed to regulate the railroad companies. And regulate means that they had to control them a bit, control their prices, or tell them they couldn't charge too much or whatever else. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. They also believed in something called the silver standard. And this is kind of a complicated idea, but basically to make cash more available, many farmers believed that the value of the dollar had to decrease. And the government determined how much a dollar was worth based on the value of gold in the world market. And many farmers felt that it should be based on gold and silver and what those two metals were worth. And as a result of that, they were going to push for what was called the silver standard. And we'll talk about that a little later. They also want to see the government change. And so they wanted term limits on the president and vice president, secret ballot. And if you remember going back to the Constitutional Convention, the framers of the Constitution determined that senators from each state would be chosen by state legislatures. And many of these farmers believed that it should be in the hands of the people to determine that there should be direct election of senators. And one of the other big demands they're going to push for is the 8-hour workday and restrictions to immigration, which doesn't sound like it has a lot to do with farming, but we're going to talk about why they supported that, and I'm going to ask you about that in a bit. So to do this, farmers started to organize. And one of the first farmers groups was the Patrons of Husbandry, also known as the Grange, and that's the name you're going to need to know more, is the Grange, or they're often called the Grangers. And at first, their efforts were more in strength in numbers. In other words, they formed things like cooperatives. So when they bought seed, for example, they would buy them in bulk in large groups and save money. But as time went by, they started to become more and more organized. And they joined up with some groups called the Farmers Alliances and the Colored Farmers National Alliance. Now, you notice with those two separate names that the Farmers Alliances were based a little bit along racial lines. A number of farmers' alliances were founded in the South by white farmers. And so black farmers had to kind of form their own organization. And so that's important to understand that all farmers are facing many of these problems during that time. In the 1890s, though, they start to get political. They form a political party called the Populist or People's Party. So when you see populism, think of the people as we move forward. So there's two questions you've already been shown that I want to make sure you think about in your next post. The first is, why do you think farmers' organizations would support regulation or government control of the railroads? And the second one, I think, is a little tougher, but why would they have reason to support an 8-hour workday and immigration restrictions? And I'll give you a little hint to think about whose support they might get besides other farmers in all this. So just give it a shot and see how you do.